It was an ordinary morning at the international airport, where travelers moved in waves of hurried footsteps, pulling their luggage through the glossy floors. Some faces carried the fatigue of long journeys, others the excitement of new beginnings. Among them was a tall black man, dressed simply in a navy blue suit, carrying only a leather bag and a quiet presence. His accent, unmistakably African, was revealed when he greeted the airline staff at the gate, his words carrying a rhythm that spoke of faraway roots and a deep heritage. The man was polite, composed, and observant. He scanned the rows of waiting passengers, nodding at an elderly woman who smiled back, before calmly joining the line to board. What nobody around him knew was that behind the reserved demeanor was a person whose life and influence reached far beyond what appearances revealed. As the boarding call echoed, he stepped forward, offering his ticket to the flight attendant at the entrance of the plane. She glanced at him, her eyes narrowing with a flicker of something between irritation and arrogance. She forced a smile, the kind of smile that wasn't warm but rehearsed, before waving him toward his seat. But as he spoke, thanking her politely in his accented English, her expression shifted, and what lingered on her lips was not a greeting but a small, mocking chuckle. He noticed it. Everyone in line noticed it. Yet he said nothing. He quietly moved down the aisle, finding his seat in business class. His movements were deliberate, almost graceful, as though he was used to carrying himself with dignity, no matter how he was received. The flight attendant, however, seemed unsettled by his presence. As she passed down the aisle checking seatbelts and carry-ons, she made a subtle remark under her breath, imitating the cadence of his accent while speaking to another crew member. She thought it was clever. She thought it was funny. She did not realize that others around her, including passengers seated nearby, exchanged disapproving glances. The air grew heavier, though she remained oblivious, caught up in her own careless display of superiority. The man sat quietly, gazing out the window as the plane prepared for takeoff. His silence was not weakness, nor was it ignorance. It was patience, the kind of patience earned by years of enduring the same type of condescension, the same shallow judgment, from those who assumed too much and understood too little. He closed his eyes briefly, as though steadying himself for the long hours ahead, not just of the flight, but of what was to come. Once the plane was in the air, the routine of service began. The flight attendants wheeled carts of drinks and snacks down the aisle, their movements practiced and efficient. The same attendant who had mocked him earlier stopped at his row. She leaned in with that same thin smile, asking if he wanted a drink. When he replied, again in his accent, soft yet confident, her smirk deepened, and this time she exaggerated the way he spoke, repeating his order in a taunting tone before handing him the cup. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. A couple even frowned at her behavior. But no one said anything, choosing instead to avoid confrontation. The man accepted the drink without complaint, his calm eyes meeting hers briefly before turning back toward the window. But inside, he was not unaware. He was not unaffected. He was simply choosing his moment. The flight stretched on, and the pattern repeated. Each time he interacted with the attendant, her tone grew more dismissive, more mocking. To her, he was just another passenger, someone she could belittle without consequence, someone whose presence on the plane would fade once they landed. To her, he was invisible in his importance. But the truth was far different. This man was not merely a passenger traveling across continents. He was a name known in boardrooms, universities, and even among governments. He was a philanthropist, a visionary, a builder of opportunities in places most had long ignored. His work had touched lives across borders, and his influence extended quietly but powerfully into industries the flight attendant would never imagine. And yet, at this moment, he was simply a man being mocked for the way he spoke, for the accent that carried his identity, his history, his story. As hours passed, small details unfolded that hinted at who he was. Another flight attendant, noticing him, recognized his face from a magazine profile months ago, though she said nothing. A businessman seated across the aisle glanced at him with a sense of familiarity, as though recalling a conference where the man had been the keynote speaker. Even a young passenger, scrolling on her phone, froze briefly when she stumbled upon an article bearing his photograph. But the mocking attendant remained unaware. Near the end of the flight, turbulence shook the cabin, jolting passengers from their seats. Fear rippled through the rows, and the flight attendants scrambled to steady themselves and reassure everyone. The mocking attendant, flustered, nearly lost her footing, and it was the man she had ridiculed who reached calmly to steady the cart she nearly dropped. His voice, even in the midst of chaos, was soothing, steady, and reassuring. For the first time, she met his eyes without arrogance. And for the first time, she saw something deeper than the accent she mocked. She saw authority. She saw calm power. She saw a presence that unsettled her, though she could not yet name it. When the turbulence passed, the cabin quieted again. But in that silence, something shifted. The man remained quiet, but his dignity spoke louder than any words. The flight attendant returned to her duties, though now her confidence seemed cracked, her smile less certain. The plane neared its destination. The city lights glittered below like scattered jewels, welcoming travelers to a land of opportunity. The man sat upright, his eyes fixed ahead, knowing that once the plane touched down, his identity would no longer be hidden. The very person who had mocked him would soon learn the truth, not through anger, not through revenge, but through the simple weight of who he truly was. And as the wheels lowered and the announcement rang through the cabin, the stage was quietly being set. What awaited upon landing was more than just the end of a flight. It was the beginning of a revelation. The attendant had no idea that her mocking laugh would become a memory she would never forget. Because the passenger she ridiculed was about to change her life in ways she could never imagine. The landing was smooth, the wheels touching the runway with a soft thud as the cabin filled with the familiar mix of relief and impatience. Seatbelts clicked open, overhead bins slammed shut, and passengers leaned into the aisles, eager to be the first to disembark. The air buzzed with the familiar chaos of arrival. Yet beneath the surface, something else lingered, an unspoken tension that seemed to hover between one passenger and a single attendant. The man rose from his seat with unhurried grace, retrieving his leather bag from the overhead compartment. He thanked the crew with the same calm politeness he had shown throughout the flight, his accent steady and unapologetic. The mocking attendant avoided his gaze, her once confident smirk now dulled by an unease she couldn't quite explain. For the first time during the journey, her laughter had disappeared. As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the atmosphere shifted. A group of men and women in suits were waiting at the gate. They weren't ordinary greeters. Their posture and precision revealed they were part of something more formal, more serious. They greeted the man with visible respect, offering firm handshakes and careful nods. Some passengers passing by slowed down, curious, sensing that this quiet traveler was someone important. The attendant, walking behind with the rest of the crew, caught sight of the scene. Confusion flickered in her eyes. She wondered why an apparently ordinary passenger was being received like a dignitary. She brushed it off, telling herself it was none of her business. Yet something gnawed at her, an intuition that she had underestimated him, that her careless behavior might echo louder than she ever intended. The man walked with his escorts through the terminal, his calm stride unbroken, his dignity intact. Cameras flashed discreetly at a distance as a few journalists documented his arrival. His name was whispered among them, but not loudly enough for the attendant to hear. By the time the crew reached their hotel for rest, the incident seemed nearly forgotten. The mocking attendant laughed with her colleagues over dinner, brushing away the subtle guilt she felt. But the next morning, her world began to tilt. News headlines filled the screens in the airport lounge. On every television, in every feed, appeared the same man she had mocked less than 24 hours ago. His name was spelled clearly across the bottom of the screen, Dr. Kofi Adeyemi. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was one of the most respected philanthropists on the continent, a man who had risen from humble beginnings to build schools, hospitals, and technology centers in places long abandoned by opportunity. His work had lifted entire communities out of poverty, earning him recognition not only from global organizations, but even from presidents and prime ministers. He had come to the city not as a tourist, but as a keynote speaker at an international summit, where leaders, innovators, and activists had gathered to discuss the future of global development. His presence was not just respected, it was celebrated. The mocking attendant froze as the television showed his face. She remembered the way she had laughed at his accent, the way she had mimicked his words for amusement. And now she saw that the very voice she had mocked was the same voice that moved nations, the same voice that inspired thousands across the globe. Her laughter suddenly felt small, hollow, and shameful. Her colleagues noticed her silence. They, too, realized who he was, and their expressions shifted from casual disinterest to quiet astonishment. One of them whispered that they had seen his face in magazines, that he had been awarded humanitarian prizes, that his foundation had donated millions. The mocking attendant said nothing. She simply stared at the screen, her stomach tightening with a weight she could not shake. Meanwhile, Dr. Adeyemi stood before the summit later that day, his voice echoing through the grand hall. He spoke not only of progress and innovation but also of dignity, respect, and the importance of valuing every human being regardless of status or appearance. His words struck deep, resonating with the audience, drawing thunderous applause. Unbeknownst to the mocking attendant, a recording of her behavior on the plane had surfaced online. A passenger seated nearby had captured the moment when she imitated his accent, sharing it with the caption, "This is how a man of honor was treated mid-flight." The video spread quickly, gaining traction on social media, stirring outrage among viewers who recognized the man and admired his work. The airline's management soon received complaints, demanding accountability for the behavior of their staff. The mocking attendant's laughter, once so carefree, now echoed back at her as a haunting reminder of what carelessness could cost. Days passed, and the ripple effects grew. While Dr. Adeyemi did not publicly address the incident, his silence carried its own weight. He did not call for punishment, nor did he demand retribution. Instead, he continued his work, attending meetings, giving interviews, and meeting with leaders who valued his vision. His quiet strength spoke louder than anger ever could. But for the attendant, the silence was heavier than any reprimand. She lived in dread, unsure if her job would survive the backlash, unsure if she could ever escape the shame of being known as the woman who mocked a man of such stature. Her colleagues distanced themselves, reluctant to be associated with her mistake. Even passengers on future flights recognized her, whispering among themselves, leaving her increasingly isolated. One evening, unable to bear the tension, she sat alone in her hotel room scrolling through articles about Dr. Adeyemi. She read about his childhood in a small village, about the hardships he endured, about the scholarships he earned and the empire he built, not for his own vanity, but to uplift others. She saw pictures of him opening schools for children who once had no classrooms, donating medical supplies to communities ravaged by disease, and sitting humbly among villagers, listening to their needs. For the first time, tears filled her eyes. She realized that the very accent she had mocked was not a weakness but a badge of triumph, a melody born from resilience, culture, and history. And she, blinded by arrogance, had treated it as something to laugh at. The weight of regret pressed heavily on her. She wondered if she would ever have the chance to make it right, or if her careless cruelty had forever closed the door to redemption. But fate, it seemed, was not done with her story. For the next flight she was assigned to was bound for the same city, on the same route, and she soon discovered that Dr. Kofi Adeyemi would once again be on board. The thought left her trembling. The chance for confrontation, for apology, for something, anything, was approaching. Whether it would be her downfall or her salvation, she did not yet know. But one thing was certain. She could no longer hide from the consequences of her actions. The morning sun stretched across the runway, bathing the airport in golden light as passengers filed in, preparing for their journeys. The flight attendant moved through the terminal with her polished uniform and trained smile, yet her steps felt heavy, her confidence fractured. She carried the weight of her mistake, the shadow of her mockery, and the humiliation of knowing the world now saw her through a lens she had crafted with her own careless hands. Her schedule had been routine until she saw his name on the passenger list again, Dr. Kofi Adeyemi. Her heart tightened. Fate had placed them back on the same flight, and this time there would be no escape. As boarding began, she stood at the entrance to the plane, greeting passengers with rehearsed warmth. But when he appeared in the line, tall, calm, leather bag in hand, her voice faltered. His presence was composed as ever, his gaze steady. He did not show anger, nor did he offer a smile. He simply extended his ticket, and she, with trembling hands, took it. For the first time in years of service, her words caught in her throat. She managed a quiet greeting, her voice thinner than she intended, before stepping aside to let him pass. He walked to his seat, his composure unshaken, while she stood at the doorway fighting to keep her mask from breaking. Every fiber of her being wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, to beg forgiveness, but the weight of his silence reminded her that some wounds could not be erased with hurried words. Throughout the flight, she found herself watching him from a distance. He sat with quiet dignity, reading documents, occasionally jotting notes in the margins, his focus sharp and unbothered. Other passengers recognized him and whispered with admiration, but he paid no mind. He carried himself with a calm authority that needed no announcement. When it came time for service, her hands shook as she approached his row. She offered him a drink, her voice softer, humbled, stripped of the arrogance she once carried. He accepted it without a word, thanking her politely. His tone was the same as before, gentle, accented, steady. But this time, it pierced her deeply, reminding her of the cruelty she had once inflicted on something so natural, so beautiful. She moved through the cabin, haunted by the memory of her own laughter. The other attendants noticed her unease but said nothing, their eyes betraying quiet judgment. The video of her mockery had made her infamous in ways she never imagined, and now every gesture felt like a desperate attempt to rewrite what was already carved into memory. Hours passed, and the flight neared its destination. Just before the descent, the intercom announced a special acknowledgement. Dr. Adeyemi was traveling not just as a passenger, but as an honored guest of the nation they were landing in. He would be addressing another summit, one focused on youth empowerment and education. Passengers applauded, and the crew offered congratulations. The mocking attendant's heart pounded. She realized this was her moment, not to erase the past, but to confront it. After the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, she hesitated, then stepped forward. She stood near his row as he gathered his belongings. For a moment, she thought he would pass by without looking at her, and perhaps that would have been easier. But then his eyes lifted, meeting hers directly. In that instant, the mask she had held together shattered. Her voice, unsteady but sincere, broke the silence. She apologized, not with excuses, not with defense, but with trembling honesty. She admitted her arrogance, her mockery, her blindness. She confessed the shame she now carried, the regret that had followed her every step since that day. The cabin was nearly empty, but those nearby heard her words. A hush fell over the space. Everyone seemed to pause, waiting for his response. Dr. Adeyemi listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, silence lingered for a long moment. Then, with the same calm dignity he had carried throughout, he spoke, not with anger, not with condemnation, but with a measured gravity that struck deeper than any rebuke. He told her that her laughter had wounded not him, but herself. That mocking another person's accent was mocking their story, their history, their culture. He reminded her that dignity does not come from the way one speaks, but from the way one treats others. And then, to her astonishment, he told her he did not hold resentment. Forgiveness, he said, was not about erasing what had happened, but about choosing not to let it define the future. He told her to learn, to grow, to use the shame she felt as a reminder never to belittle another person again. His voice was steady, accented, and powerful, the very sound she once ridiculed now washing over her as wisdom. Tears streamed down her face. She could hardly speak, but she managed to thank him. Thank him not only for his forgiveness, but for the lesson she would carry forever. As he walked off the plane, surrounded once again by people waiting to greet him with respect and honor, she remained frozen in place, shaken yet strangely lighter. She realized she had been given something far greater than she deserved, the chance to start again, armed not with pride, but with humility. News of the encounter spread quietly, as stories often do. Some passengers spoke of witnessing a moment of forgiveness, a moment that carried more weight than any reprimand. For Dr. Adeyemi, it was just another reminder of the mission he carried wherever he went, to uplift, to teach, to heal even in small moments. For the attendant, it was a turning point. She never mocked another person again. She listened more, judged less, and carried herself with a humility born not of weakness, but of transformation. Years later, she would still remember that flight, not as the moment she was humiliated, but as the moment she was given a second chance by the very man she once laughed at. And the world, watching from the outside, was reminded of a truth too often forgotten, that the voice of dignity, no matter the accent, speaks louder than arrogance ever could.